Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, Amjad Salim. The Central African Republic is suffering the worst year in its history according to Amnesty International. The African nation has experienced over 12 months of terror since the partially Muslim Seleka rebels seized power in an attempted coup, prompting the largely Christian anti-Balaka militias to retaliate with an unprecedented ferocity. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims across the country have been driven away from their homes and towns, with estimates of some 650,000 being internally displaced, whilst another 300,000 have fled to neighboring countries. The Seleka stepped down from power earlier this year following sustained international pressure and has been replaced by an interim civilian government. But this has not halted attacks on Muslims by the anti-Balaka, which remain intent on driving them from the country. Foreign troops, including French and African Union forces, have been deployed to the country in an attempt to maintain order, but killings continue on an almost daily basis, prompting criticism of the forces and their effectiveness and speed in responding to the conflict early on. In this first half, we will be looking at the role of the French in the conflict and its former colony, and whether the international community could have done more to help. Joining me in the studio to discuss this are Paul Melly, Associate Fellow in the Africa Programme at Chatham House, Xavier Chatel, spokesman of the French Embassy in the United Kingdom, and James Schneider, Editor-in-Chief of Think Africa Press. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. But before we start, we will take a look at a report that's been done.
One year on from the failed coup last March by the Seleka rebels, sections of whom were involved in sectarian reprisals against the Christian majority, the Central African Republic seems to be mired in a conflict that many outsiders fear will escalate to genocide. French and African Union forces intervened last December to try and stem the violence, sending over 8,000 troops into the country. But reports of sectarian violence against Muslims by the Christian militias have largely continued unabated, with many people on the ground saying that the situation is deteriorating. The French operations in the country were initially intended to last just 6 months, but now look to be extended beyond this time frame. Visiting the country last month, President Hollande said that the military would step up efforts to keep peace in the country.
What is our objective now? It is to secure not only the capital, but the west of the country too, where particularly tough militia are carrying out executions, and we must do whatever possible to disarm them.
While international forces have prevented the violence from deepening, observers and human rights groups say that the peacekeeping forces have been thinly stretched and have not been able to stem the daily horrors inflicted on civilians, including the reported massacre of a bus full of Muslims, who were killed with machetes and knives by Christian rebels outside a mosque in the nation's capital. Tens of thousands of lives are estimated to have been lost, with many analysts saying that more people have been killed than injured in the conflict.
I ask the people who are trying to destroy their own country, be it the Seleka or anti-Balaka, to stop their atrocities. They are still here in the country, killing people, committing massacres and stealing. They should stop their actions.
In response to the growing crisis, the UN looks set to back a 12,000-strong peacekeeping force, with a resolution expected to be drawn up by France later this month. In a press conference following a meeting of the UN Security Council, the UN Secretary-General appealed for dialogue between the different groups in the country.
What we are seeing is the manipulation of religious and ethnic affiliations for political purposes. I am hopeful that the people of the Central African Republic can step back from fear and find their way back to the coexistence that had been the country's long-standing tradition. I reiterate my appeal for more troops and police to protect the civilians, more aid to save lives, and more support for the transitional authorities in their efforts to rebuild the state institutions.
However, any UN force that deploys in the Central African Republic won't be deployed until after summer, and many fear that for a country that has driven out nearly all of its Muslims, merchants and cattle herders responsible for food production, the death toll through famine could climb much higher before then.
I am here because while there is much going on in the world, the people who have been affected by the crisis here in Central African Republic are not only being forgotten, they are now being ignored. And we cannot allow children to go hungry. We cannot miss the planting season while the world ignores the people of CAR.
Nathaniel Amos Sansom, Islam Channel.
Thank you. Paul, looking at what we've seen on the report and what we've heard in the news, it's often painted as a religious conflict. And this is something that I think even people in CAR are quite anxious not to portray this as. But what point was there a tipping point in terms of how this moved from a political climate, which I understood it always to be, and it's not just in the last 1 year, it's been for the last 10, 15 years, to becoming a religious conflict?
Well, it's a country that's had a very long history of weak government, instability, coups, rebellions, political leaders who organize militias and, for example, will recruit militia fighters sometimes from surrounding countries such as Chad to kind of support localized rebellions. But it's never really tipped before over into a huge intercommunal conflict where it's reaching down, if you like, into the civilian population where people are participating on both sides in large numbers. And what really seems to have made the difference this time is that during Seleka's period in power, when they seized power in March, they were a movement that were originally Central African with their roots in the north of the country, but whose leaders had actually recruited a lot of the fighters from outside, particularly Chadian Janjaweed warlords who weren't Central African, who had no particular connection with the country, and essentially engaged in a reign of terror for 8 months. And that wave of violence and persecution, which was very often sectarian in form, for example, they would go into villages and they would spare Muslim families and then burn down the homes of all the Christians or rape all the Christian girls while sparing the Muslims. That triggered, if you like, a reverse reaction with the Anti-Balaka, which are essentially a Christian sectarian militia who are equally bad, possibly even worse now, in the scale of the atrocities they're carrying out. But I think we mustn't forget that what happened from March to December of last year really was an awful reign of terror where the international community was quite slow to act and really bring itself to a point where it really would intervene. In the end, it was only when the French stepped in and they had to go alone because nobody else would follow from the wider international community that something was done about it. So people had 8 months when they were very specifically being targeted, often on religious and ethnic grounds. And I think that's created the bitterness that's produced this horrific backlash we're seeing now.
Xavier, we've heard about in the piece, and Paul has mentioned about the role that France has played. Do you think that this has been something that has been prompted because of a former colonial legacy, or is it something that you feel that needed to be done because of the French interests? What prompted France to take that initial step in terms of responding when the international community seems to have been fairly silent in this regard?
It's not really, so thank you for the question. It's not really a question of French interests, really. We have a shared history with the Central African Republic, which materializes in French citizens in the country. So there's still around 600 French citizens, many of them dual nationals in the Central African Republic, and we also have had a history of having to put some military assets in order to facilitate the evacuation of French and European citizens in the past. And obviously we have links of friendship with this country, which is francophone and which is also, as you were mentioning, a former French colony. However, when French President François Hollande came to the pulpit of the United Nations General Assembly in September and issued what he said was a cry of alarm for the dramatic slide in the circumstances in the Central African Republic, it was not a question of interest. I think it was a question of recognizing that something really nasty was happening and that the whole international community needed to be aware of it and needed to intervene.
Thank you, Alexander. James, do you think that French diplomacy and military response, has that been enough? Could they have done more, or is there something that was lacking in that? And perhaps following on from that, I'd like to get others' thoughts as well. As in terms of the international response, why is this not a bigger issue in terms of the international scene. But
well, I think it's more the international response that has been found lacking rather than the French response. I mean, you could perhaps quibble that France could have done a bit more, but relative to everyone else, it has done far more. The international community doesn't have much of a long-standing interest in the Central African Republic. It doesn't have very many champions or people who have interest in them, whether they be kind of narrow self or national interests or more humanitarian interests in the country. And so it's been rather easy for it to be ignored or for it to just fall down the pecking order in the list of other international crises which people take interest in.
And Paul, do you think that you mentioned the role of the Janjaweed from Chad? How much of the issues of the Central African Republic are actually not outside its borders? I mean, how much of it is it a victim of regional pressures that are taking place?
Well, it is in a region where most of the other countries have political fragilities, and in the case, for example, of Democratic Republic of Congo or South Sudan, active conflicts. But I don't think you can say that they've spilled over really into the CAR. What's going on really is essentially internal to the country, and the fighters who came in from outside didn't come because the CAR was part of some wider conflict they were involved in. They came, I think, put crudely, because if you're a former Janjaweed and things have quietened down in Darfur, what are you going to do now? If you're a former Chadian mercenary and you're effectively unemployed without a conflict to go and fight in, the CAR was an opportunity. I don't think one can see this as a crisis that's been born out of a regional problem, except in the sense that the regional bloc to which the CAR belongs, the ECAS bloc of countries, is one of the weakest of the regional groupings in Africa. In contrast to ECOWAS in West Africa or SADC in Southern Africa, you don't have a very strong bloc of countries with a strong structure of commitment to governance principles or political partnership. So although ECAS countries have tried to manage this crisis and probably done better than in any previous episode, still relatively it's a region of weak political leadership and lack of coordination, lack of sort of early warning structures and partnerships. So I think all that's contributed quite a lot to why the CAR crisis was able to happen without anyone really doing anything until it was too late.
Right. Ban Ki-moon sort of suggested that one of the solutions is long-term, more peacekeepers. Xavier, do you think that that is one of the solutions? Is that what France is looking at? Is it looking at a long-term presence of troops on the ground or UN presence? I mean, is that a solution to this crisis, or is it more of a stopgap measure in the event of finding something more long-term?
I think it's definitely the answer that we're looking for at the moment, and there are several reasons for that. The first reason is, I think it's a classic case for a UN peacekeeping operation. It's a complicated religious setting, as the UN has experienced in many other crises. The UN has very large experience in dealing with this sort of situations, be it in the Balkans or be it in many African countries. The other thing is, if you have the UN backing, it means you're going to have UN planning, which is going to support the African forces. You're going to have also UN logistics, which is going to step in. You're going to have also a system of rotation of troops, which is going to make it easier for troops to be perennial in their deployments. And also it's going to beef up the numbers. So for all these reasons, I think it's a classic case for a UN intervention. Also because it combines both the military aspect and the civilian. And there's been for a long time what is called the BNUCA, which is the UN civilian presence, so to say, in the Central African Republic. And this will be used and increased and also leveraged in order to have a civilian political solution. There's an enormous importance of the civilian component because there will be elections, so elections must be prepared. You must get the whole public service restarted. You must get civil servants to be paid, and all this takes a sort of civilian machinery that the UN is very well equipped for.
So in terms of the current interim government, do you think that why haven't they been able to bring about some sort of peace and stability. This is a question I'm putting to you, Xavier, but feel free to answer. What is lacking in the interim government's resources at the moment that is prohibiting them from actually bringing this out? And is long-term peacekeepers the role? I noticed you were nodding your head when Xavier was speaking. James, I mean, is this something that you feel?
The state has no capacity to do anything, and we shouldn't be expecting the interim government to be able to do really very much at this point, and the state capacity is effectively nil. And there's one additional point to why the UN force is important, is because it will enormously beef up policing capacity in the state, which is a real problem at the moment. Part of the reason why there's so much impunity and the violence has got down into the civilian population, and it can take place in these very seemingly sporadic and isolated but also intense and vicious forms, is because there is no real policing, no real court system and no real prison system that's currently operational. So when UN forces come, there will be a policing contingent which will be able to start rolling back on this impunity. But in terms of, of course, the long-term stability, development and prosperity of the Central African Republic is not based on it being occupied by international forces into the long term. But right now, they're so required, it's absolutely crucial.
And Paul, in terms of building that capacity of the interim government, I think both Xavier and James have alluded to the fact that the UN comes with that civilian role. But what is the role of the international community in that? I mean, so far, apart from France, it's been very little attempt. I know there have been pledges for, I think, something $500 million, I think, through the country assistance plan, but nothing really has materialized. How do we enthuse the international community, so to speak, to actually support this very vital aspect of capacity building of the interim government?
Well, one of the biggest problems is that the CAR is a country that's very little known to most of the international community. Hardly any countries other than France and a few African neighbours, for example, and the US have embassies there. There's very, very little knowledge. Agencies that, say, in the Sahel or in the Democratic Republic of Congo would be well involved. Countries such as Britain that have substantial involvement in many other parts of Africa, or the Nordic countries who are very big development spenders. In the CAR, the presence is minimal. And there are very few people with the expertise and the country knowledge. This is a country with only 4 million people as well. So at a purely human level, the level of interaction, the number of people who know Central Africans, who have family connections there, is going to be much smaller than, say, for Mali with, 15, 16, 17 million people. So in that situation, when the UN goes in, because it's financed centrally through the normal UN funding mechanism, one of the advantages is that as a UN member state, each country that's a member of the UN has to cough up for that funding pot. So the financing of the peacekeeping, instead of being done on a voluntary basis with those donors who can be interested enough in the CAR to contribute, there's a system. The money is automatically on tap. Of course, it requires lobbying by the UN, but it's lobbying for its operations, in a sense, worldwide when it does that. And I think one of the other things that the UN brings is this sense of an organized structure. It's quite striking when you see a country where there's a UN peacekeeping operation. In some ways it's slightly intimidating because it's so different often from the weak government of the country, but this huge bureaucratic machine arriving with a sense of structure and organization and how people are appointed, all of that helps to get buy-in from the international community, and people begin to feel comfortable with it. And at a human level, for example, international officials who network with each other, they'll arrive, they know somebody else who was on another operation somewhere else. So it builds confidence, and it builds a certain sense of solidity of something happening. And that's particularly needed in the CAR because the state is close to non-existent, so fragile. It's not like going into a country like Mali where you have a fairly reasonably functioning state machine already. In the CAR, somehow someone needs to demonstrate that organization and government and state capacity can exist, and in a way the UN can do that.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much. We're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we'll be looking at the humanitarian angle of the CAR conflict. Thank you.